Daniel chapter 11, if you'll turn there this morning. Daniel chapter 11 means there's only one chapter left, and that's chapter 12, and we'll look at it, the Lord willing, next Sunday morning. It's been a wonderful study going through this Old Testament book. Chapters 1 to 6 were familiar to us as we looked at Daniel in the lion's den, Daniel and his three friends in their opposition to the culture that they lived in Babylon. The boys, even in chapter 3, willing to go into the furnace rather than back down or capitulate and worship a false idol, showing their commitment all throughout their exploits and activities, even in that pagan land. And God deciding on occasion to humble rulers like Nebuchadnezzar to reveal future things that he would accomplish. And so those chapters familiar to us. Turning to chapter 7, not necessarily in chronological order, that is that chapter 7 through 12 proceeded what happened in chapters 1 to 6, but intermingling even some of the visions in chapters 7 to 12 with earlier events or earlier times in the book. We see God revealing to Daniel visions and dreams concerning the future for what would be called the Jewish nation. And last week we said that chapters 10, 11, and 12 go together. They're a whole, but we're separating them just for ease of our study. And in chapter 10, we noticed that Daniel was given information by some sort of being, beginning in verse 5, that resembled or that had close parallels, it seems, with the same being that John saw in the book of Revelation in chapter 1. And the identity of this particular being, it was a spiritual being. It was not a man, even though Daniel says he looks like a man. Clearly it was an angelic being, or perhaps even a representation, a manifestation of God himself. Jesus, perhaps. Some would say it's a Christophany, Christ in the flesh before he came to earth. It doesn't really matter what identity we give this being, but Daniel is given information from him about a time. Notice verse number 14. What will happen to your people? Daniel, your people, the Jewish people, in the latter days. The vision refers to many days yet to come. And Daniel's shocked at that. He's astounded. He's frightened even. And certainly any mortal would do the same in the presence of spiritual beings of this magnitude. But Daniel is told that he is greatly beloved, verse 19, and to fear not. And he has been given this information again and has recorded it for us for our benefit about what would transpire in the course of the Jewish nation in years to come. We said that chapter 11, verse 1, probably better belongs to the activities or to the information given in chapter 10. And we'll notice that momentarily. But this chapter, now coming to chapter 11, is a continuation of that vision that Daniel was given in the previous chapter. This information starts about 527 BC. If you're a person that enjoys dates, about 527 BC, that corresponds to what chapter 10 verse 1 said, the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia. And it will go all the way up, chapter 11 will, until about 165 BC, a period of more than 350 years. Now, depending on what we do with chapter 12 may go on up even into the time of Christ. That's debated even the end of chapter 11, and might even detail all the way to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Some say that's not the right way to understand chapter 12. Some say it is. We'll debate that maybe more next week than we will this morning. But Daniel records history in advance. He is, in the truest sense, a foreteller, a prophet. He is not writing after the fact. It's easy to tell history after the fact, if you will, but Daniel is foretelling the future. And in these 35 verses, or in the first 35 verses of chapter 11, there are over 130 different prophetic predictions. Now, that's an amazing number when you think about it. 130 predictions about what would come to pass in the first 35 verses of chapter 11. And there's more specific predictive prophecy in this chapter than anywhere else in Scripture. I don't mean the whole of Scripture. That would be perhaps an unjustified overstatement. But condensed in one particular place, Daniel chapter 11 has more to say about the future and how it unfolded than anywhere else in Scripture. And again, roughly at least 350, maybe more than 400 years of events. Was Daniel a prophet or a historian? He's a prophet. And he will be writing about this period that sometimes is called the silent years. Or the silent years is the term given to the close of the book of Malachi, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, at the end of the Old Testament, before we read anything in the book of Matthew. That's roughly a 400-year period, and the intertestamental period is another name that historical period goes by. But it's sometimes assumed or it's alleged God was silent. And as it relates to recorded messages, that's true. We don't have written, inspired prophets recording for us any revelation or vision from God from the time that the book of Malachi closes to the opening of the book of Matthew. But that's not to say God had not spoken about what would transpire in this time period. That's what Daniel, especially chapters 10, 11, and 12, are all about. Those that have the workbook and those that don't, let me just read this as kind of my disclaimer this morning. The following material, that is what I'm going to give you, both by in the spoken word and what I've already written for you, is just a brief overview of how most, and maybe that term's a bit of an overstatement, how I could say how many conservative scholars understand the prophecies of Daniel and how they correspond to what is recorded in history. Now, if you want to do additional research, you can find a number of detailed histories, commentaries, and other resources to deepen your understanding. And there is much in this chapter about what's going on historically, politically, culturally, religious ramifications to the Jewish people and the larger region. Some of these things, those of you that have looked at history or might be a fan of history, you'll recognize that I'm not going to insert. But you may have heard about for instance, the Battle of Marathon, about the Spartans at Thermopylae. You've heard of Hannibal. You've heard of some of those names from history. All of those guys kind of play into this chapter a little bit, not directly to the Jewish people, but to the larger geopolitical world and what was going on in that time period as Hellenistic culture, Hellenistic ways, and certainly after the death of Alexander, the conflict with the East and the West, if you will. In Israel, the people of God are kind of right stuck in the middle, especially they're stuck between the northern group known as the Seleucids and the southern group known as the Ptolemies. And that's what's going to play out in Daniel chapter 11. Now, we've already seen some of this. Again, let me just say, verse 1, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood up to confirm and strengthen him. Well, who's the I? This I is this individual that is described in chapter 10, this angelic being that says to Daniel, there was a battle, there was a fight. The prince of the kingdom of Persia, verse 13, withstood me 21 days, but behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I had been left alone there with the kings of Persia. This is a spiritual conflict that is being described. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means it's a spiritual conflict. It means it's not the physical battle between armies or militaries, even though that might be a component of it, or at least an expression of it. But there's something going on behind the scenes. There's something in the unseen realm. And while we have a number of questions, I know you do just like I do, we have little to no definitive answer to most, if any, of these questions truly. Daniel is told, again, whoever this prince of the kingdom of Persia is, evidently he's an adversary of the way that is right and true and good, the way of God. 21 days, 3 weeks, this conflict ensued. And finally, Michael, one of the chief princes, whom we turn to the New Testament and see Michael mentioned as an archangel. An archangel simply means kind of a rank, a high-ranking angel, came to help me. And how does, this battle between good and evil play out? I don't know. But he had been left there with the kings of Persia, maybe with their spiritual representatives or their evil influences. We don't know. So regardless, verse 1 of chapter 11, even I stood up to confirm and strengthen him. This angelic being, this spiritual being, assisted, it seems, what he's suggesting in verse 1, he assisted Darius in overthrowing the Babylonians. Because Darius was the leader of the Medo-Persian Empire. And again, we see that transition from one government to the next, from one empire to another. The Babylonians are taken out of the way. Belshazzar is slain that very night. Daniel, you remember, interprets a dream, the writing on the wall in chapter 5. And that was a physical, transition of power. There were armies, there were men involved in it. But somehow, at the same time, in conjunction with that, there's this spiritual aspect to it. And this being tells Daniel that he helped Darius, the Medo-Persian regime, come into power in overthrowing the Babylonians. Again, why or how or what? We're left without answers. So now, verse 2, Daniel continues to receive this information. Now I will tell you the truth. Well, we wouldn't expect anything else other than that. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia. And the 4th shall be far richer than all. By his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will. And when he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be uprooted, even for others besides these. All right, well, what's that about? Verses 2 to 4 record that transition in power from the Persian to the Greek Empire. And you remember that we have already given, or have been given in the book of Daniel, information that would be truly what would transpire. As early as chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar was told, there's a great image, Nebuchadnezzar. You're a head of gold, but you're not going to last. There's going to be another part of that image, and that image is going to have a chest of silver, and it's not going to last. Then there's going to be thighs of bronze, and then there's going to be feet and legs and toes of iron, and each of these 4 different parts represent a different kingdom coming onto the scene. And so from the Babylonians we will transition to the Medo-Persian Empire, and from the Medo-Persian Empire then to the Greek Empire. In chapter 7 from a few weeks ago, you remember Daniel is able to see 4 great beasts coming out of the sea. And again, those 4 different beasts representing 4 different empires. Most notably in chapter 8, Daniel is told about one that he saw a ram with 2 horns, one higher than the other. Again, representative of what we know of the Medo-Persian Empire. But then I saw a male goat come with great speed and strike that ram and overpower it. And again, then it would be broken into pieces and divided into 4. And all of that, again, confirmation that we're talking about here, the Greek Empire. And notice verse 2 says he will stir up all against all the realm of Greece. The Medo-Persians succeeded in conquering not only Babylon, but much of the Mediterranean and much of the Greek Hellenistic world initially, because the Greek people like to fight with each other, the Greeks and the Spartans and the Athenians, and they could not form an alliance. They would just fight against each other, weaken one another, and then the Medo-Persians could kind of, with a superior force, just kind of keep them in check. Alexander comes along, and this is a gross, maybe just a gross summary, and JC, you can cringe if you want to, but Alexander comes along and just says, hey guys, if we all get along, we're stronger than they are. There's more of us than them, or at least the same number of them. If you'll unite under my leadership, I'll show you how we can take care of business. And that's essentially what Alexander did. He joined all of the Greek city-states together. He was a brilliant military tactician. He's still studied at West Point today, and his tactics are in some of his battles, at least what we know of them. So he unites them all, and he says, we can take care of business. And he did. He ran the Medo-Persians all the way out of the land. He goes as far as the Indus River in India in his speed, and we'll talk more about him momentarily. But what we see here is that 3 kings arise in Persia. The 4th king, and I can give you, and I wrote it down somewhere here. There we go. If you're interested in him, from Darius, there's a guy by the name of Cambyses that reigns from 530 to 521 BC. He is succeeded by a guy for just a year who tries to probably do some, underhanded things, and he claims to be someone he's not. So he claims to be a guy by the name of Smerdis, who would have been the rightful heir, but he's not really that guy, so history calls him Pseudo-Smerdis. What a name. 521 to 486 BC, Darius the Great, or Darius the Great, comes into power. And then finally, the last king that reigns under the Medo-Persian Empire is a guy by the name of Xerxes. Now, all of those guys are mentioned in Scripture. Cambyses is mentioned in Ezra 4, verse 6, and part of the resettlement of Jerusalem. This second guy, Pseudo-Smerdis, is mentioned in the second half of the book of Ezra, chapter 4. Chapters 5 and 6, Darius the Great makes proclamations regarding the Jewish people and their rebuilding of Jerusalem. But Xerxes is better known to us in Scripture by his name Ahasuerus. And he is the king mentioned in Esther, chapters 1 to 10. And he is the one, of course, who will marry Esther. And he is the one that will be this final king that rules over the Medo-Persian Empire. And as he is there, kind of doing his thing, if you will, Alexander has amassed his army. Now, it has to be noted that Ahasuerus was a very wealthy guy. He ruled over 127 provinces, or kind of districts. Esther chapter 1, verse 1 says, from India to Ethiopia. And you can see a little bit there on the map of what that would be represented of there in your handout. Verse 3 skips over the reign of the subsequent 8 Persian kings in 150 years of history to arrive at a mighty king who is not a Persian ruler. And that's evident by verse 4, which says, when he has arisen, this is talking about who history calls Alexander the Great, his kingdom shall be broken and divided to the 4 winds of heaven. And that's the same idea of those images back earlier in Daniel chapter 8 about the 4 heads of that beast, the 4 wings and so forth. 4 is a recurrent number. And the reason why was following Alexander's conquest, leading the Greek Empire. He runs roughshod, again, over not just the Mediterranean world, but then on into the Middle East, all the way to India, if you know your geography. He gets all the way to India, and that's kind of as far as his troops can go because he's really exhausted them. He comes back to Babylon, and one historical account says he cries because there are no more worlds to conquer. He's 32 or 33 years of age. There's debate about that. But he dies in Babylon at the age of, we'll say, 33 without an heir, without a successor. He has a wife. She's a Persian princess named Roxana. She was with child and did give birth to a son. They name him aptly Alexander the IV. They try to keep him in seclusion until he was old enough to take the throne, but rivals, we're not sure exactly who, poisoned both he and his mother in 310 BC when he's only 13 years old. So he never gets a chance to reign. And as Scripture states, none of Alexander's descendants, notice verse 4, shall be broken up, talking about his kingdom, divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not among his posterity. The Bible's telling you what's happening in advance. And it's absolutely exactly what history corresponds to. Not according to his dominion with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be uprooted even for others besides these. And so the great empire, the great Greek empire of Alexander the Great divides, or is sectioned off, between his 4 most prominent generals, who each wanted, if you will, a piece of the pie. This is called the didaskoi, which is just a Greek word which means 4 parts, basically. And you see there in your little map these 4 kingdoms that divided from the Greek kingdom. The Macedonian, or the Macedon kingdom, which is over on the Greek peninsula itself. The Pergamum kingdom, or the Pergamum section of it, that is in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, and also the northern part of the Greek peninsula there, in the area formerly, or that will be known kind of as Europe later, of course. Then the Seleucid Empire, which took up a big chunk of the territory you see there represented in yellow. And then at the bottom, the Ptolemaic Empire, especially in the region of Saudi Arabia and modern-day Egypt. So you see that Palestine, or the land of Israel, with that arrow for Jerusalem, is caught in between the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid Empire. And if you'll turn to the back of your workbook, you may say, well, so what? Preacher, you've given me a good little history lesson already this morning, but so what? Well, verses 5 to 20 in Daniel chapter 11 is the account of the residual conflict between the Ptolemies in the south and the Seleucids in the north. And that's what it's about. Now, if you want to know the history of it, you'll have to consult something other than what we're going to do in class this morning. And the reason why is there's just too much information to cover. Most commentaries take anywhere from 20 to 60 pages to describe what happens in the remainder of Daniel chapter 11. Naturally, we can't explore all of that this morning. So you say, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to simply look at verses 5 to 20 concerns this residual conflict. Again, the land of Israel between the north and the south of these two kingdoms. They're the buffer state, so to speak, and so they just fight back and forth, back and forth, back and forth all the time. And then we're going to look at one that's going to arise, and that's verse 21. Actually, verse 20 is kind of a transition verse that will especially impact God's people. We've met him before. He's a bad guy named Antiochus Epiphanes IV. And then we're going to see what God's going to do to him and kind of what we take away from all of that. So maybe I can succeed at what I've just told you I want to do. In verses 5 to 20 then, the king of the south shall become strong, as well as one of his princes. He'll gain power, have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. At the end of some years he'll join forces. The daughter, and you see all of this but a branch. And then verse 8, carry some of their gods captive to Egypt. Then the king of the north, and you have this in verses 5 to 20, the king of the north will do this. Then the king of the south will do that. And then this will be the response. I know it doesn't mean a lot to you, and I'm probably, if I redo this workbook sometime in the future, I'll just leave out that chart. But those of you that have the workbook, you see the chart there that says the original founder, 312 BC, you have Seleucus, the king of the north, Syria. But at the bottom you see the king of the south, Egypt, under the reign of Ptolemy. And it didn't even print very well. It may be hard to read, but you see just kind of the back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth between these successive rulers. Now, if you have a good handle of the historical events of what happens during this time period, then this chart's helpful. But without all of those details, without spending at a minimum probably a couple of hours giving you those details, that chart may mean very little to you this morning. So ignore that if you wish. You won't hurt my feelings at all. But verse 20, actually verse 21, this last verse in verse 20, the last guy to come up, he'll be destroyed within a few days, not in anger in his battle. But verse 21 beginning, in his place. And in his place is a reference to a king of the north, a Seleucid ruler. In his place shall arise a vile person, to whom they will not give the honor of royalty, but he shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue. Antiochus is a guy that's a conniver. He's a manipulator. He tries to play the political game. Again, the details of his rule and reign would bear that out, that I'm not going to share with you. He's going to come in, though, and he will act, verse 23, deceitfully. He shall come up and become strong with a small number of people. Daniel is being told information that would seem outrageous at the time. It would seem that this guy is running counter to the way that political rulers usually operate. But what's so amazing, and what I want to try to impress upon you, is this is exactly how it plays out. This is exactly what happens in history. He will enter peaceably, even into the richest places of the province. He shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers. He shall disperse among them the plunder, the spoil, and the riches. He shall devise his plans against the strongholds, but only for a time. He's such a crafty guy in what he does. He's operating in a way that no one really before him has operated. And he's succeeding in that, or he appears to be succeeding in that. Daniel's telling us what he's going to do more than 200 years before he does it. He shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall devise plans against him. Yes, those who eat of the portion of his delicacies shall destroy him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. The intrigue and the attempted coups and insurrection and mutiny even in his army. History bears all of that out. Both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table, but it shall not prosper, for the end will still be at the appointed time. While returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant, so he shall do damage and return to his own land. Again, you say, well, that doesn't mean anything at all to me. You're right, in one sense, it doesn't. But what we are trying to see is that Daniel is telling us, again, how this is going to operate, how it's going to come to pass, the fruition of it. And Antiochus here, I give in your handout, I meant to read this for you. He arises. He is one who takes power due to the untimely death of his predecessor. His enemies or his opponents call him Antiochus Epiphanes, the madman. He prefers Antiochus Epiphanes, God manifest. But all of this, again, 400 years in advance, Daniel is disclosing to us. In verses 25 to 29, 2 Egyptian campaigns are described. And he's going to try to take power back from the Ptolemaic Empire, the Ptolemy rulers. God's people are in the middle. This is what we have to keep in mind. They are in the middle. And when he is here defeated after he tries to go south into Egypt, he notice verse number 30. This is where we really get the emphasis for God's people. Therefore he shall be grieved and return in rage against the holy covenant and do damage. So he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. Okay, here's what happens in essence. Antiochus, he says, I'm a strong guy, I've got a big army. Now I'm going to vanquish my enemies to the south in Egypt, the Ptolemies. He thinks he has sufficient power to do that. He marches on Egypt and he's defeated. Some say that Rome actually comes to the aid of Egypt during this time to kind of push back against him. That's debated. The Bible doesn't concern that detail necessarily, perhaps. But regardless, this guy who reigned in the north in Syria, he comes down through Israel. He tries to go to Egypt. He tries to take it. He's defeated. And so he has to retreat. To retreat, he has to go back through the land of Israel. He has to go back through Jerusalem. He has to go back through where God's people are. And what does he do? He returns in rage, verse 30, against the holy covenant and does damage. He shows regard, he shows favor for those who forsake the holy covenant. He spared the Jews who weren't living like Jews in essence, if you will. He is so outraged and so just, I guess you could say, angered by his defeat that the Jewish people who would not serve his false gods, he's going to turn against them. Notice verse 31, it says, they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. If that sounds familiar to you, it should, because Jesus makes mention of that in connection to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in Matthew 24. But that's not what Daniel here is describing. Daniel is describing what we only know from intertestamental period history, books like 1st and 2nd Maccabees and others in the Apocrypha, that Antiochus was so wicked. He was so angered, smarting by his defeat, that he comes back into the land of Judea and he kills a number. One commentator said that maybe when he came back through Jerusalem and Judea, he may have killed over 80,000 Jewish men, women, and children, just because he was mad that he was defeated in the south in Egypt. Further, he took much of the city's valuables. He took away, or he attempted to take away, the daily sacrifice in the temple. He took away even the opportunity that many had to worship God as they had previously. And this abomination of desolation is probably the descriptive phrase that describes how he went into the temple and built an altar on top of the temple or on top of the altar that would be used for burnt offering to sacrifice to God, but instead he built an altar to Zeus and there offered a sow pig in and around 168 BC. For the Jewish people, that was outrageous, of course. That was terrible beyond what words could describe. A pig was an unclean animal. God said, have no part with that. Zeus, of course, a false god, but that's what he sets up in the temple. That then is the impetus. Maybe there were some events prior to that for sure, but it was maybe the match that lit the fuse that led to what we know as the Maccabean Revolt. And the Maccabean Revolt by Judas Maccabeus, actually his father kind of headed it up, but he and his brothers, they would fight back. And again, the book of 1st and 2nd Maccabees will describe that. And they will eventually succeed in driving Antiochus and his forces out of Jerusalem. They will rededicate the temple. In and around 165 BC, that will become known as the Feast of Dedication, or more commonly known today as Hanukkah. And there are some really intriguing things that transpire as it relates to the menorah and lights and things of that nature. But we see Jesus in the Gospel of John celebrating the Feast of Dedication. Even though there's no mention of it whatsoever in the Old Testament, that's what it's referencing, this historical event. And so Antiochus is here just a bad dude in every sense of the word. And he's a terrible guy. And there's no other way to describe him other than that. Those who do wickedly, verse 32, he shall corrupt with flattery, but the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. If you take nothing else away from the lesson this morning, please take that with you. Verse 32, those who do wickedly against the covenant, he shall corrupt with flattery. In other words, the Jews that went along with him. There were plenty of Jews who said, hey, you got to go along to get along. It looks like our God's not going to help us, so this Antiochus guy, he seems to have the power. We'll just go and serve his God. They went right along with it. But there were a faithful few, just like there are in every period of history and every time, I think. Even today, we may feel as if we're in that minority. The people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. Some see that as a prophetic reference to the work of Judas Maccabeus and the Maccabean Revolt. I can't say it is, or I can't say it's not definitively, but that's one idea. But regardless, there was a faithful minority to God who would not give in. A faithful minority who would not, even under the penalty of death, renounce their faith. And we see that repeated, of course, in the New Testament age at the close of the first century and then the first few centuries thereafter. We see that in certain parts of the world today. We even have brothers and sisters this morning who are mistreated and persecuted. Sometimes even, maybe occasionally. It's happened in my lifetime for sure. Even those who for the cause of Christ have been killed. And we wonder, is that going to be something that in the future we might even face in this land? Who's to say? Who's to know that but God Himself? But even if it were, and even if it is, it's something that we will face. Let us be the people, like verse 32, who know God. And if we know God and we know what He has promised us, we'll be strong. And we'll persevere, we'll endure, we'll be victorious, even if that means we lose our lives here on this earth. Eternity will be secure because of what Jesus has done. Those are the people who understand shall instruct many, yet for many days they shall fall by sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. Now when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join with them by intrigue. I wish I had a good explanation for that. Simply to say, Daniel, your people are going to suffer, and they're going to suffer terribly. But will you be faithful to God even when you suffer? That's the question. Some of those of understanding shall fall to refine them, purify them, and make them white until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. Daniel is being told, and he is no doubt, as we've read already, very troubled by this. The way is going to get difficult. Yes, you'll come out of captivity. Yes, your people will be returned to their homeland. But don't think that that means all of your troubles are past. You will still be, maybe even we could say, disciplined by God for some of their iniquities, for some of their wickedness and idolatry through the centuries. But those who know their God can still be strong. That's what we must keep in mind. Now, verses 36 to 45 in Daniel chapter 11, what's that about? Some would say verses 36 to 39 continues to talk about this bad guy, this leader of the Seleucid Empire, Antiochus Epiphanes. That's seemingly my understanding of it. Others would not agree with that, but again, we're just not being dogmatic either way. He shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished. Notice the end of verse 36. Till for what has been determined shall be done. He shall regard neither the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God. He shall exalt himself above them all. He shall honor a God of fortresses, a God his fathers did not know, silver and gold, precious stones, pleasant things. He shall act against the strongest fortresses with a foreign god, which he shall acknowledge and advance his glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many and divide the land for gain. What are those details? They're hotly debated. I'm not going to worry you with those details. Verses 40 to 45, some would say belong to a future time. Some say we're still dealing with this same time period of history. Some would say this is a reference to the very end of time. I don't like that idea because I don't know what it would do really for Daniel. But this is, of course, a passage that those who believe in premillennialism, for instance, like to use at their disposal. The time of the end, this king of the south shall attack him. The king of the north shall come like a whirlwind, and all of this. And so they work into their prophetic program all of these fanciful notions. And, again, depending on what time period of history you live, it might be the Roman Empire that they think is going to do this. Well, we're past that. Well, what about now? Maybe it's some force in Europe. World War II, is this talking about Nazi Germany? Well, that came and went. Well, is it talking about during the Cold War era, and maybe even still today, the activities of what the Russians are going to do? Or is it going to refer to some power out of Asia, what communist China is going to do? I don't see all of that in this. I don't, in my analysis of it, see that Daniel's talking about anything regarding the end of time or the contemporary time in which we live, or even into the future, but he's describing what would befall his people. Remember, that's what he was told, what will happen to your people, to the Jewish nation. And there's no merit in my understanding to assign this to some future Antichrist sort of figure and try to work it into that program. Some would say that this is describing the Roman Empire with chapter 12, then further, as we'll talk about next week, describing what would happen when Jesus arrives on the scene and what he would do and how the Romans would eventually dispense entirely with the Jewish nation. And it would be destroyed in AD 70 when the city of Jerusalem was destroyed. There is, I know you say today there's a nation of Israel. There is. But there's not a Jew on the planet today who can trace his or her lineage back to Abraham. They cannot, by merely physical descent, identify themselves entirely with certainty as being an actual Jew. Today, the nation of Israel, if you want to call it that, according to Galatians chapter 6, Paul said, we are what? The Israel of God. We are the people of God today. So there was a transition from a physical nation to a spiritual group of people who are the people of God. Now, I know that's a lot, to put it mildly. What benefit did this information have for Daniel, future Jews, and for believers today? For Daniel, I don't know. Other than he said, or he could take solace in the fact that God's in control. What benefit did it have for future Jews? The question that's asked often that I don't have a good answer to is, what did the Jews who lived after Daniel do with this information? Did they read it during the intertestamental period? Was it available to them? That's a hard question to answer, and we don't really know for sure. What benefit does it have for us today? It's simple this. God knows the future. It unfolds according to His plan. And for those who are putting themselves into God's plan by obeying His Word, it's going to turn out okay for us. That's all I know to do with it. Be a part of those who, as described in verse number 32, the people who know their God. Let us be the people who know God, and we only know God by obeying His Word, by listening to its instruction. This question, you might think, is a little bit of a trick one. Has God revealed the future to Christians today? Has God told us the future? Yes, absolutely. The book of Revelation is clear. Now, I know you say, well, it's not clear when I read it. There's this animal and this beast and this image, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. It's crazy. There's a lot of stuff in there I don't understand. You're right, I don't either. But the book closes with one simple truth. God wins. God reigns. Jesus is on the throne. And His people who are obedient and faithful to Him are right there in His presence for all eternity. And so if God wins and Jesus wins, then the question we must ask ourselves is simple. Am I on His side? Am I serving Him? Will I be among those who have victory in and through and because of Christ Jesus? Thank you for your good attention. I know that's so very much, and maybe there's just something in there that hopefully you can latch on to give you hope and confidence that no matter what we live in, what troubles we face in this life, that God's in control of it all, and He will work it out as He knows best. And one day, as the old hymn puts it best, heaven will surely be worth it all. And let us live with that confidence each day. Thank you for your good attention this morning.